Today I'm going to be starting part 2 of a presentation that I started previously, and that is on the power of choice to make change and where story fits in. We've been talking about where change and story move together. We're going to finish that. Where I left off, I suggested that I asked the question, what does it mean to see or not see? In fact, Jesus asked a very interesting question. Do you remember with the woman with the ointment, when she was at the house of Peter, I believe it was, when Jesus said, "Do you see this woman?" I mean, she was standing right there in front of everybody. So when he said, "Do you see this woman?" he was asking something different. Do you really see her? Well, we're looking at different kinds of sight this morning, and I talked to you about my nephew whose eye was okay, but the messages weren't getting to his brain, so they had to cover his eye. So he could see, but he couldn't really see. So his eye was working, but he couldn't see. Now, real quickly, I want you to tell me, give me a reason why that is untrue, why that is not true. Blood is red.
It's written in blue.
Good! That is the first time anyone has ever said that.
What did you say?
Because it's written in blue. On the bottom? Yeah. Oh.
The word blood is in blue right there. Now I have given this, that was very good, Horace. I have given this lecture many times and no one has ever caught that.
Wow. Awesome.
That was very good. And the reason for that is people aren't trained to really see. They start, in their nervousness, will start thinking of all kinds of reasons. Well, how could this not be true? Of course, there are many, many reasons why that isn't true. That's only one. But as you can see, it's the most apparent. That the word blood right there is written in blue, which proves that blood can be blue, at least on paper. All right, but most people will say, well, you know, venous blood is more bluish. If it doesn't have oxygen, it's more blue. And they won't see that reason. Okay, we fail to see for many reasons, one of which is physical. There are other reasons we fail to see. Now I'm going to talk about emotional sight. I'm just going to talk about 4. There are many, many reasons, but we'll look at these 4. We've talked about attachment a little. The secure attachment means you have someone that can reach in and understand your perspective, and also they hang on to their own perspective. That's secure attachment. But I want to talk about avoidant attachment because, well, there are several kinds of insecure attachment. But I'm going to talk about 2, avoidant and anxious. Now, going back to our picture, avoidant attachment is when a mother or a primary caregiver holds on to their own perspective and is not able to enter the perspective of another. Now, what's interesting is it still looks like love. Because you have a parent that will come in and maybe say to a baby, you're okay, there's no reason to cry, you're all right. So they can see the bigger picture. What they're not able to do is reach in and say, oh, I'd be upset too if I were you, or I know why you're crying, your little diaper's wet. Okay, that's how it looks when you're little. When you're older, it would look like a parent that might say, you're going to do what? That's not the best thing for you. You know that's not right. You can't make money doing that. So you see them holding on to their world, but they can't enter into yours. Okay, so what does that have to do with seeing? Well, that kind of attachment is called avoidant attachment, where you've had someone close to you who holds on to their world, does not hold on to yours. What happens is you begin to say, as a very small child, then I must take care of myself. Okay, that's different from anxious attachment. If you have someone that's totally over-involved in you, you become so afraid that that's what everything is. Your world is what the whole world is, and you become very anxious. That's a different issue. But with avoidant attachment, you grow up saying, I've got to take care of myself. Now, how does that affect sight? What that does to seeing is because you're focused on taking care of yourself, you tend not to notice the environment. You don't see the environment. And people with avoidant attachment then grow up, it's really interesting, not having many memories of childhood. Why? Because they weren't there. They weren't watching. Their attention was not out there. It was more here, not in a selfish way, but in a protective way. So what very often, and I did a research study on this, very often people will say, I don't have many crisp memories of childhood. What they don't realize is that that way of memory is pervasive in their life. It isn't just about childhood, it's about everything. It's a kind of memory people have also who are depressed, where they're trying to cope, and so they're not focusing out there. They also have fuzzy memory. So how you think and how you're coping affects your ability to see other people. So you'll find, or even the things outside yourself. So you'll find if you're struggling, if you're depressed, if you have avoidant attachment style, your focus will be more here on coping and protecting, and you will not see what's going on out there. So that's one thing that affects our sight. Those who have avoidant attachment style do not pay attention to the external world. Thus, they fail to see, and their memories are actually different. And I won't go into that too much. Another thing that causes people to fail to see is trauma. Now, why am I putting a snake here? Because twice actually this has happened. I live in Cherry Valley, and we'll soon be moving to Live Oak, where my fiance lives. But in Cherry Valley, I once walked into my garage and I'm always walking into my garage, but this particular time I went into the garage, I went through the laundry room into the garage, and I was doing something, and on my way back I saw a rattlesnake coiled up. I had stepped over the rattlesnake to get into the garage. Yes. And so the problem was I couldn't get back into the laundry room because the rattlesnake was right there in the doorway, coiled up, ready to strike. Well, the other thing that was true is I couldn't lift up the garage door because the button was just over the rattlesnake. So it was slightly traumatic for me. Here's what's interesting. Ever since then, and that was about 2 years ago, ever since then, every time I go into the garage, I step a little further over because of where that rattlesnake was. Now, that's a little miniature example of what trauma does. It causes you to behave differently, sometimes when you are not even aware. Other times, and I'll show you we'll use a story of a child flying a kite. A child is flying a kite, and a dog comes along, and the child is growing up thinking that the dog is kind, the dog is fun. So he's playing and flying a kite, and oh, there's a dog. Then the dog bites him. Okay, in the future, what is the child going to be afraid of? Dogs? What else? Possibly. Yes, possibly kites. Because with trauma, sometimes pieces fall out. And you become afraid of things and you don't know why. So I'm afraid of walking through that door even though the snake is not there. And that's the nature of trauma. Now, here's the interesting thing is when you experience trauma really early in your life, then you don't know what has dropped out. So you'll find women who are afraid of men and they don't realize it's because they were abused early, or you have men that are afraid of women and they don't realize it's because of some issues they had early, or are afraid of night, or I could go on and on. These little fears, and they come out when you find yourself getting more angry than you ought to get over something. You're like, why? Why am I this angry over this? Something probably has dropped out of the field, out of what you can see, and you're reacting out of implicit memory, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So with trauma, we begin to see what is not there, or imagine something there that isn't. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the foundation of what's causing that. I'm going to give you a quiz at the end of this, all right? So get ready. Life is made up of patterns. Patterns that begin at first to be like those little flower necklaces that you make when you're young. I don't know if you guys made that, but girls make those little flower necklaces where they'll take a dandelion and tie it to the stem of another dandelion, okay? And they make a little necklace. Okay? Patterns start like that. They can easily be broken. You have to treat them very gently because they can easily be broken. And I remember when you put that little flower necklace over your head, you had to be very careful. But over time, those patterns move from being like little dandelion necklaces to being like chains, and they're almost impossible to break. Then they go one step further, which many people don't talk about, and that is that they become unconscious. So they go from being a flower necklace to being like a chain that can't be broken to being invisible. Now, at which point do you think it's most difficult to change? When they're like the flower necklace? Of course, no. When they're like the chain, or when they're invisible? Sure, of course, when they're invisible. Because a chain you can work with if you can see it, but when it's invisible, you can't. So let's talk about visible and invisible memory. That's explicit and implicit. And I'll help you with your quiz here, because explicit means sort of X or outside, something that you can see. It's something that's conscious and attention is needed. So here's an example of explicit memory. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Oatmeal.
Shake.
A shake. Okay. That's explicit memory, when you can go back and get it and remember it. What did you do on your favorite birthday? A birthday that you really enjoyed. What were you doing?
Eating German chocolate cake.
You were eating German chocolate cake. Where were you?
In the backyard.
In your backyard. Is anybody else there?
Oh, my family.
Family? Okay. Explicit memory is like that. When you remember something, you are there. Those other people are there. You can hear sounds. You can smell things. It's all, you take the past and you bring it present. That's what an explicit memory is. It's also called autobiographical memory. Why? Because when you add one explicit memory together with another and another and another, that's who you are. That's your autobiography. So when people write a memoir, they're simply stringing those memories together and telling a big story as they put them all together. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is implicit memory. But there we go. All right. Implicit memory. Implicit memory is unconscious. And it's a wonderful thing because it's impossible to remember everything unless you are, and there's a phrase that was commonly used and still used sometimes, is an idiot savant. Those people aren't idiots. They're actually very intelligent. And the problem, though, is that and it was displayed in the movie Rainmaker of many years ago, where somebody can't forget. See, that's the problem there. They can't forget. So they look at something, they remember that. Another thing, they remember that, and they can't put it into implicit memory. And that's why they can remember, much of a phone book, because they can't let all those details go. So a really good and helpful thing that our brain does is it forgets. That's what implicit memory is. Your brain doesn't really forget, but it takes something and it puts it in your unconscious. And let me ask you this. How many of you do not know my middle name? do not know my middle name? Okay. And how many of you do not know Carol's middle name? Okay. Everyone in this room just raised the same hand twice. Now the question is why? Why wouldn't you give this hand a rest? Why wouldn't you say, okay, I'm going to raise this hand for a while, now I'm going to give this one a chance? Why? Because, yeah, because your body, and that's more physical memory, but it's a type of implicit memory, your body wants to put as much as it can into implicit memory. Why? Because you want to make room for other things. Because if you don't, then you're like the man I just talked about that is stuck remembering all these phone numbers. So that's a good thing. So whenever you do something and then you do it a second time, just like that, your brain is thinking, oh yes, because I'm going to try to put this into implicit so I can make room for other things. So it's a good thing, because eventually you start acting on automatically. That's also the bad thing, because when you start putting bad things, bad pattern, bad behavior into implicit memory, you start doing that automatically. So let's look at your things that go into implicit memory. Your ways of eating, your attachment patterns. Your attachment was formed way before you can even remember, before the age of 5. You can change it somewhat a little past that. But before the age of 5, you don't remember hardly anything. Most people have their first memories right around age 5. So before you're even able to have explicit memories, you've got patterns that have laid down. And that's why it's almost impossible to change your attachment style, because it was laid down before you can even remember in implicit memory. So you've got family patterns, how you react when you're angry, how you think, the kind of words you tell yourself when you make a mistake. So you find when you make a mistake, you go, you know, are you so stupid? Why did you do that? That is laid down in implicit memory. All right, so here's your quiz. You go to tie your shoelaces. Implicit or explicit? Implicit, good. You see a shadow and you feel afraid. This is a trick question, because you're actually seeing something. But what's that? That's right. It's implicit, because it's in our natures to jump when we see something that we can't make sense of. Recall your last birthday party? Explicit, good. Describe the previous slide if you remembered it. That would be explicit if you remember it, that's right. Cross your legs while sitting? Good, implicit. All right, you've got it down. We cannot see that which is unconscious, but the worst part is we cannot change what we cannot see. So we have all this, we want people to lose weight, we want them to be nicer to their spouses, we want them to listen better, and people are not able to do that because they can't see what they're doing wrong. And we're not carrying around video cameras and say, hey, although we have threatened that. I've heard spouses say that to each other. If I just had a camera, I would take a picture, take a video so you could see what you're doing. You could hear what you're saying. All right. So, the most important thing we have is choice, but for those things that are laid down in implicit memories, we don't even have choice over those. You see what I'm saying? So that's why it's very important to really look deep, and through counseling or listening to other people, listen to what people say they see in you, because you can't see it yourself. Okay. Now, here's what's interesting. We talked about Erickson's stages of trust versus mistrust, where it starts. Where we're all headed in the last stage is generativity versus shame and doubt. So at the end of life, we will either want to give back to others or we will want to keep it all for ourselves. All right? We're either going to be generative or we're not. Here's what's interesting. McAdams did a study on Americans in later life, and he found that there was a quality in generative adults that the non-generative adults didn't have. And the quality was those that were generative, those that in later life were able to give back, were also those who told redemption stories. Now, let me explain what a redemption story is. It's not just that they told happy stories. There's a difference here. They told stories that took narrative turns. Let me describe that. So they might say, oh, I had a rough childhood, but then they would turn it and say, just like my mom did. Remember I told you my mom does this and then turns? He said they would start telling the truth about some difficulties in their lives, but then they would say, but I made a shift and I did this, or but I learned something and I went on. So they were able to take the negative and turn it or learn from it into something that was redemptive. They weren't what we call Pollyannas. Everything's happy, everything's cheerful, but they were able to recognize what wasn't and then turn it into something that was helpful. So, highly generative adults tend to construct stories that feature redemption sequences. All right. Those that weren't generative tended to enter in contamination sequences. So they could take good, fun times and find something that didn't work out with it and send it to a bad end. All right. All right, so identity is a life story that's partly imagined, but not imagined out of thin air. There's a complex relationship between what happens and how we remember, what we choose to tell and how we remember it. So when you think about who you are, it's not about what actually happened to you. We also did a study on women who had been abused, and we found that there would be women who would tell exactly the same story, exactly the same kind of abuse, exactly the same abuser, you know, a father or an uncle or whatever. And one would be doing well and one wouldn't. We were, what is the difference? The difference is the story they told about it, whether they had someone to tell the story to at the time that believed them. So it wasn't the actual abuse as much as it is what they did with the story. So when you look at who you are, it's not a factor of what has happened to you, it's a factor of what stories you are telling about what's happened to you. And whether there are people who are listening to those stories and hearing you. Yeah.
So was it that they were able to tell it to someone and they believed it, or that they were telling the story in a certain way? I'm not sure I understand.
Both. That they could tell the story to someone at the time that believed them. That was one thing. And second, that they continued telling their story. It's those who tucked it in, were shameful, were not believed. That abuse just became completely destructive of their lives. And the women who were telling their stories and talking about them and acknowledging those were doing so much better, and in some ways were, in a certain way, healed from it. Not that it never happened, but were able to move on with their lives. Okay, so we talked about Proverbs, and the point I was trying to make in looking at that Proverb story is that we can be on a different path. But with whatever path you're on, you will perform the behaviors of being on that path. Okay. Now I need to talk real quickly about the layers of a story. And I'm going to ask you to watch for these. I'm going to talk about story threads, relational dance, the unsaid and unsayable, and then I'm going to talk about signifiers, or in a sense, metaphors. Okay, so let's talk about story threads first. As we talked about earlier, sometimes people have more than one story thread, right? They have several stories going on at the same time. Okay, now, let's read this, and at the end of this, I'm going to ask you what stories are going on in this. The clinician says, "How are you doing?" to a young woman with cancer. And she says, "My parents know that I have cancer, and they have been very supportive, even though having cancer is not easy. My father doesn't say much. He's kind of distant. He has his own stuff going on. He used to drink a lot, but not now. He and I have never been close. My father's like a machine. Nothing bothers him. Always calm. No emotion. Well, one time when he was facing his alcoholism, he broke down. I'd never seen my papa like that. My mom is always there to help me, you know, always cheerful like a Pollyanna. Nothing gets her down. Anyway, the cancer itself is hard. I'm 18 and I should be dating, getting married and having babies, but instead I'm sucking up chemo every week while lying flat on my back, looking at the ceiling. It's not much fun. Even God seems bored by it. Oh well, it doesn't matter. Clinician, so you're doing okay? Now what you can't see on the bottom of this is she says, yeah, I'm doing okay. All right, so story threads. What story threads did you hear in that?
About her cancer,
About her
relationship with her dad.
That's right. Cancer, relationship with her dad.
His alcoholism.
His alcoholism.
Relationship with her mom.
Yeah.
What she should be doing by now.
Yes. Yes. Her expectations for herself. Yes. Now, as a clinician, how in the world do you know which story thread to pick up on? Now, the bad part is, which one did the clinician pick up on? None. That's right. None of them. Now, there's one story thread that's sometimes hard to see, but I want you to see with a change of, I want you to tell me where her attitude about her father changes and how you know that's the case. Shall I give you a hint? No? Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds. That's what changed in him. Where is there a...
See my papa like that.
Okay. Okay, right there. There's something else in that sentence that tells you that her attitude has changed. Besides her saying she'd never seen him like that. What else in that sentence? Yes! In her narrative, now we don't have the whole narrative here. I cut a lot out. In reality, the whole first half of her narrative was all, she called her father, father. From this point on, she called him Papa. She called him Papa. And I asked her, I said, now the reality is, this, I've put two stories together because I don't want to, you know, incriminate anybody. But the reality is, when I ask her, I said, I said, did you notice that you're now calling your father Papa? And she said, no, I didn't. She did not even know that she was making that shift. And she stopped and she said, that's interesting. I said, do you know why you made that shift? And she started crying. It was really sweet. She started crying. She said, yes. She said, because that's where I knew I loved him, even though he was like a machine, yeah. And she just got all warm about, you know, about him at that point. Okay, so we've looked at the different story threads, and you identified more even than I have here. The clinician did not pick up on any of them. That's why the clinician feels good when they leave, because they're like, I listened. But the patient, and here's what's interesting. If you go in and say to the patient, was your clinician, was he nice? She'll say, oh yeah. She has no idea that he was actually very unkind. She doesn't even know it. But when you ask her, were you connected? She will know that they weren't. She will say, well, no, we weren't really connected, but he was, you know, he was there.
But question, what are the times of active listening? Because there are times in the clinicians, it's best not to say anything, just to be there with the patient.
Very good question, Jerome. Active listening, the way you know that you've been actively listening is that when you speak, you pick up on some story thread. The really wonderful thing is, it doesn't matter which one. If you just pick up on one of them, that patient will feel heard. But if you don't pick up on any of them and say, well, you know, thank you for sharing your story. Would you like to pray about it? You know, that's just unkind. Yes, yes. If you can just pick up on one or two or three of the stories, you know, I hear you saying this, this, and this. Is there anything more you'd like to say? Would you like to pray about those? Is there, you know, did I hear the right thing? Pick up on a story thread and then move forward.
You know, I just want to make a quick point. That's one. I think that's one of the disadvantages when like an institution allow other untrained people to provide pastoral care, like for the community service setting. I think that's very destructive because they're not taught what to pick up on, the cues and all that stuff. So
And Jerome, thank you. You have just given the reason for this lecture. People think listening is easy. It is not easy. And I'm trying to peel away the layers of a story so that we'll all understand how difficult it really is to really hear. And you might say, why is this in the lecture on choice and change? Because we've learned that it's within a story that people make change, is when they live it differently, tell it differently. It's only when you can really hear the story that you can help them make that change. That's why this is in that lecture, so thank you. Now let's look at the relational dance. This is the movement between the clinician and the patient. What you want to do is look for disruptions in the story, times when the clinician goes away, times when the clinician interjects their own thread, times when it was not repaired, just like we noticed the clinician just left. There are times when the patient will just leave or the client will just leave. They'll be in the middle of something, they'll say, oh, it doesn't, well, she did. Oh, it doesn't matter. It does matter because she was talking about, if we go back real quickly, she was talking about even God seems bored. That's huge. And then she said, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, it does matter. Or it might matter to her. Okay. So that's the relational dance, is where did you just go? Where did they just go? Now let's look at the unsaid or the unsayable. This is what's really difficult to do, Jerome, as you mentioned, if someone is not skilled, or Gus, both of you. When someone is not skilled, they are not able to look for the unsaid or the unsayable. The story is not only in what we say, it's in what we don't say. So let's look for it. One we've already talked about, and that is in lack of coherence. If you are with someone that talks like this, where this is a woman who was asked how old she was when the abuse started, and she starts, I don't have any idea, that's part of what I'm saying. I think there's lots of pieces I can't remember, so I really don't know. Sometimes I think it could have been a lot earlier, 3. It's like you said, I can remember, say, 2, 3 years old. I mean, she's just, it's all fragmented. And then I was probably 5 or 6. It's just going back and remembering. And at the end, well, I'll take a guess. Maybe it was 2 or 3. I mean, she took that many words to say, I really don't know. Okay, when you see or hear incoherence, that is telling you something. Either that there's been some trauma in the past, or it could be simply that a person is not able, for whatever reason, perhaps that moment, is not able to get their thoughts together. That matters. Because there is a reason for incoherence. Either that it's a long-standing issue for a very deep reason, or that currently they're having trouble telling you this story. Either one of both of those matter. Okay. Then there are other types of the unsaid. One is negations. That's any time a person uses not or doesn't or words that negate something. Now, when you ask me where I was born, if I say to you, well, I wasn't born in Minnesota. Now, exactly, what are you thinking, Carol?
Okay, so, but where else in the world might you have been born?
Exactly. Your question must be, why did she just introduce Minnesota? Whenever someone negates something, It means they've introduced a concept for some reason. So that's why when someone says, oh, I'm not angry or anything, they've just introduced anger for some reason. You don't bring in concepts for no reason, just like the Minnesota. All right, so that's negations. Revision is where someone will tell a story and then they revise it. Because we revise it either to make it less true or to make it more true, but we revise for a reason. Another one is evasion, where you ask someone, and you know what that's like. You ask someone, how you doing? And they say, I started, and you see already, they're already evading. Why are they evading? Can they not decide? Can they not remember? And silences tell you most. There's one thing I would add to this, but I didn't put it here because I'm going to talk about it a lot more later, and that is the sigh. The sigh tells you a lot. You'll watch in counseling, you've seen this in your patients, where they'll do all of this verbiage out here, and then all of a sudden they'll do this. And they've just told you something. They've just told you something. We'll talk more about that later. Okay. So here we are. Negations are using don't, not, wasn't, wouldn't. Revisions are changing the story to be more accurate or more or less accurate. Smokescreen or evasion is when they ignore your questions. Silences are pauses and silences. So let's look for them in here. It's not coming on very easily. But when she says, my father doesn't say much, okay, so there's some reason why she's bringing up the category of saying a lot. Did she thought he would? Did she think he should? Why is she saying that he doesn't do that? And then she said having cancer is not easy, and then she adds a silence right there. Now that's interesting that she would introduce the concept of easy in relation to cancer. Did she think it would be easy? Who thought it? Is there someone that thinks it should be easier than it is? Another one, my father, what is it? He used to drink a lot, but not now. So there's that comparison. He and I have never been close. Well, did she think they ought to be? Or was there, has she seen other people that are close? My father's like a machine. Nothing bothers him. Really? She just told us that he doesn't say much. He's got his own stuff going on. She says he's always calm, no emotion. Then she says, oh, well, one time. So you see her making a revision there. Really? Nothing bothers him? Well, you just said right here. All right. And then she said, I'd never seen my papa like that. And then again, nothing. Then she talks to her about her mom. Nothing gets her down. And then here at the end, she's talking about flat on her back, not much fun. And it's going to be very powerful if someone talking with her says, did you think you should be having fun right now in your life? It's going. I mean, that'll be a very powerful question. And then right here, even God doesn't seem bored by it. Doesn't matter. I mean, that's a big one I would pick up on. Really? Do you think it doesn't matter? Or to whom? To you or to him? Or to both? You know, find out what does doesn't matter mean. All right. So here we have the revision. And you see the change in my father to papa. And now we're looking at, the smoke screen. She says at first they've been very supportive, and then all of a sudden, as we read, father's not talking, mom's always happy. Really? Are they supportive? Okay, and the silences. And in this one, I've written it there where she says cancer is not easy. When you see a silence in someone, it's really important to pick up on. You know, you're really quiet right there. And do you want to talk about that? Okay, and then metaphors. We've already talked about how powerful metaphors can be. I would say above everything else, if you hear or see a metaphor, written or spoken, pick up on that metaphor, because those are real places of real potential change. Okay, now we have heard her. You see all the story threads and all the examples of where we saw those. We do not know which story thread to pursue, and you can do one of two things. You can ask them which one to pursue, or you can pursue one yourself. So in the end, when we're talking about choice and change, I have told you that all our behaviors are laid down in all these little patterns. And don't think that what you can see easily in another person, they can see. Because if it's under here, under the water, they can't see it. And they're just now behaving automatically. And it's not until you bring that up to the surface, or illness brings that up to the surface. And that's why when people are ill, it's a wonderful time for potential change, because they're looking at everything from a different perspective. So when those implicit things then begin to surface through their language, through their stories, in their awareness, that's when change is most apt to happen. And it makes working in healthcare a very exciting place. Healthcare or counseling, when people are at that place of vulnerability. All right. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gober,
Yes.
I thank you very much for this presentation.
It's beautiful.
It is well done,
Yes.
well put together.
Yeah.
Is it possible for us to get some handouts on this?
Yes. Do you mean today?
If possible, or the PowerPoint.
Every PowerPoint of mine will be in the modules. Every single one. Actually, not just mine. All of the PowerPoints will be in the modules.
Okay.
You know, sometimes you're trying to explain things to, and they don't understand.
Yeah.
I was trying to talk to a pastor who was doing some visitation, who didn't have any idea of CPE or these approaches, and it was sometimes difficult to bring the message across in looking for clues
Yes.
and thing to resonate on, to pick up on, and to ask for clarification and explanation, and it was somehow difficult. But this is very, very good, and it gives me some additional terminology that I've never thought of before.
Yeah, good. I'm happy to hear that, because I mean, this you can see it's my passion as well. When people say, "Oh, you just go in and listen," just go in and just listen to it. It's much more complex. Yeah, it's much more complex. Good. Okay. Thank you. Good.